Segment 1 Introduction The War Between Two Eras. Why historians call the Crimean War the first modern war. The conflict appeared traditional on the surface with cavalry charges, muskets, and wooden sailing ships. Yet beneath that surface, entirely new technologies and systems were transforming warfare forever. Segment 2 Europe before the Crimean War. How wars were fought before 1853 saw communication reliance on horse, messengers, limited public knowledge, and armies operating largely independent of real-time political control. Segment 3 The Telegraph changes warfare. The revolutionary impact of the electric telegraph. Government in London and Paris could receive information of the battlefield in days rather than weeks. Political leaders gained unprecedented influence over military operations. Segment 4 Railways bring industrial logistics to war. How railways transform troop development and supply systems. The Crimean War demonstrated that industrial transportation could become as important as battlefield tactics. Segment 5 The birth of the war correspondent. The rise of newspaper reporting from the front lines. For the first time, civilians could follow military campaigns almost as they happened. Segment 6 The power of photography. How battlefield photography became the realities of war into public view. Although primitive by modern standards, it changed how societies perceived warfare. Segment 7 Industrial production and modern supply chains. The role of factories, mass production, steam ships, and industrial economies. The war increasingly became a contest of national industrial capacity rather than simply battlefield courage. Segment 8 The medical revolution. The work of Florence Nightingale and the emergence of modern military medicine, statistics, sanitation, and organized healthcare began saving lives on a scale never before seen. Segment 9 The charge of the Light Brigade. Old warfare meets new reality. Why one of history's most famous cavalry charges symbolizes the collision. It's a collision between traditional military thinking and modern battlefield technology. Segment 10 Lessons learned by future generations. How military observers discovered across Europe studied the conflict. The lessons influenced later wars, including the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, and eventually the First World War. Segment 11 Why historians still debate the label. The arguments for and against calling it the first modern war. Sometimes historians point to earlier innovations, while others argue Crimea was the first conflict that multiple modern technologies combined on a large scale. Segment 12 Conclusion The war that opened the modern age. The Crimean War marked the moment when industrial society entered warfare. Governments, journalists, railways, telegraphs, factories, photographers, and public opinion all became participants in the conflict. The battlefield of Crimea provided a glimpse of a future that would reach its most devastating form 60 years later in the trenches of the First World War. Segment 1 The war between two eras. In the middle of the 19th century, Europe stood at the crossroad. The old world was fading, but the modern world had not yet fully arrived. Kings and emperors still ruled vast empires. Cavalry officers still dreamed of glorious charges across open battlefields. Generals still studied the campaigns of Napoleon Bonaparte as their ultimate guide to victory. Yet beneath this familiar surface, powerful forces were reshaping society. Railways were spreading across continents. Factories were producing goods on an unprecedented scale. Telegraph wires were beginning to connect cities separated by hundreds of miles. Newspapers were reaching millions of readers. Technology was quietly transforming the foundation of human civilization. Then came the Crimean War, fought between 1853 and 1856. The conflict initially appeared to be another traditional European war. At its center was the declining power of the Ottoman Empire and the growing ambitions of the Russian Empire. What began as a dispute involving religious rights and imperial influence soon expanded into major international conflict. Britain and France entered the war on the side of the Ottoman Empire, determined to prevent Russia from dominating the Black Sea region and upsetting the balance of power in Europe. To many observers at that time, the war looked familiar. Soldiers marched in bright-colored uniforms, officers rode horses, muskets remained the primary infantry weapon, massive fleets sailed across the seas. The battlefield experience often resembled conflicts that had been fought for centuries. Yet historians would later argue that something fundamentally different was taking place. The Crimean War was the first major conflict in which industrial age technologies began shaping military operations on a significant scale. For the first time, governments could communicate with distant battlefields through the telegraph. Railways became essential tools for moving supplies and troops. Newspaper reported events from the front with unprecedented speed. Photographers captured images of war that civilians could see with their own eyes. Industrial production supplied arms with resources on a scale that previous generations could scarcely imagine. These developments may seem ordinary. Modern societies are built around instant communication, mass transportation, global media, and industrial manufacturing. But in the 1850s, these innovations were revolutionary. They changed not only how wars were fought, but also how governments governed, how citizens understood conflict, and how military power itself was measured. The Crimean War represented a collision between two different ages of history. On one side stood the traditions of the old world. Generals relied on aristocratic leaderships, cavalry tactics, and assumptions formed during the Napoleonic era. On the other side stood the emerging forces of industrial modernity. Machines, communication networks, public opinions, and mass production were beginning to influence events in ways that military leaders barely understood. This clash produced extraordinary results. Heroic acts occurred alongside catastrophic blunders. Technological progress existed beside shocking incompetence. Modern communications revealed failures that previous governments might have hidden. Public outrage became a strategic factor in wartime decision making. The relationship between the battlefield and the home front changed forever. The war also exposed a harsh reality that would define many future conflicts. Technological advancement didn't necessarily reduce suffering. In many cases, it increased the scale and visibility of human misery. Soldiers continued to die in terrible numbers from disease, poor planning, logistical failures. New technologies offered unprecedented capabilities but also revealed weaknesses that had previously remained invisible. By the time peace arrived in 1856, the Crimean War had transformed military thinking across Europe. Government studies its lessons carefully. Military observers analyzed every success and failure. Engineers examined the impact of railways and communications. Journalists reflected on the growing powers of the press. Politicians realized that the public opinion could no longer be ignored during wartime. The conflict didn't create a modern warfare overnight. Many aspects of future war were still decades away. Machine guns, tanks, airplanes, and radio communications had not yet appeared. However, the Crimean War demonstrated that the direction in which warfare was moving. It revealed a future where industrial capacity, information network, logistics, and technology would become just as important as battlefield courage. For this reason, many historians describe the Crimean War as the first modern war. It was not because every aspect of the conflict was modern. Rather, it was because the war marked the moment when the industrial age began to reshape the conduct of war in ways that could never be reversed. The battlefields of Crimea became a testing ground for the future. The soldiers who fought there often believed they were participating in a familiar struggle between empires. In reality, they were witnessing the birth of a new era. The world that emerged after the Crimean War would be faster, more connected, more industrialized, and ultimately far more destructive than anything their predecessors had known. The road to the 20th century began in the mud, blood, and confusion of Crimea. Segment 2. Europe before the Crimean War. To understand why the Crimean War was revolutionary, it is necessary to understand the world that existed before it. For centuries, warfare had changed surprisingly little in its most fundamental characteristics. Weapons improved, armies grew larger, and empires rose and fell, but the basic structure of war remained recognizable from one generation to the next. Communication was slow. This single fact shaped nearly every aspect of military operations. Before the middle of the 19th century, a government in London, Paris, Vienna, or St. Petersburg couldn't instantly communicate with commanders hundreds of miles away. Messages traveled only as fast as horses, ships, or human couriers could carry them. News from distant battlefields often required days or weeks to reach political leaders. In some cases, information even took longer. As a result, generals enjoyed enormous independence. Once an army marched into the field, its commander often operated with little direct oversight from the government. Political leaders could issue instructions before a campaign began, but once battlefield commenced, commanders frequently had to rely on their own judgments. Decisions made on the battlefield could not be reviewed in real time. Mistakes might not become known until long after the damage had already been done. This created a very different relationship between politics and war. Governments often had only a vague understanding of what was happening at the front. Rumors circulated more quickly than verified information. Reports arrived incomplete or outdated. By the time leaders learned about a victory or a defeat, the military situation might already have changed dramatically. The experience of ordinary civilians were equally different. Most people knew little about wars while they were being fought. Newspaper existed, but reporting was limited by the same communication barriers that affected governance. Journalists rarely accompanied armies in combat zones. Delayed battlefield reports were uncommon. Citizens often relied on official announcements, letters, or delayed newspaper stories to understand events. In many cases, a major battle could occur and the public might not learn the full details until weeks later. This delay created a significant advantage for governments. Information can be controlled, filtered, or shaped before reaching the population. Military failures were easier to conceal. Political leaders could manage public perceptions more effectively because there were few independent sources of information capable of challenging official narratives. Transportation posed another major limitation. Before railways, armies depended heavily on roads, rivers, and animal power. Moving troops was a slow and difficult process. Supplies traveled in wagons pulled by horses or oxen. Food, ammunition, and medical equipment and other necessaries often moved at a painfully slow pace. Campaigns were constrained by geography and weather. Muddy roads could cripple military operations. Harsh winter could isolate entire armies. Logistics, the movement and supply of military forces, was often the deciding factor in warfare. Generals understood that an army marched on its stomach. Feeding thousands of soldiers required enormous effort. Maintaining supply lines over long distances were frequently more difficult than winning battles themselves. The limitation of transporting affected strategy as well. Armies could not rapidly reinforce distant positions. Large troop movements required extensive planning. Mobilizing a nation for war was a lengthy process involving countless logistical challenges. Military operations unfolded according to the speed of horses and human endurance. Even the battlefield itself reflected an older age. The Napoleonic Wars, which ended in 1815, remained the dominant influence on military thinking throughout Europe. Officers studied Napoleon's campaigns as the highest expression of military genius. His victories were analyzed in military academies. His tactics shaped generations of commanders. As a result, many armies entered the 19th century believing that decisive battles remained the key to victory. They emphasized offensive action, bold maneuvers, and the aggressive use of cavalry. Heroism and leadership were often viewed as more important than technology or industrial capacity. Yet, beneath the surface, the foundation of this war were beginning to crack. The Industrial Revolution was transforming economies across Europe. Factories producing goods at unprecedented rates, steam engines powered transportation and manufacturing, railway networks expanded year after year. Scientific discoveries accelerated technological innovation, urban populations grew rapidly, literacy increased, newspapers reached wider audience than ever before. These developments were not initially designed for warfare. They emerged from economic and social changes sweeping across industrial society. However, their military implications would soon become impossible to ignore. Governments gradually realized that industrial power could translate into military power. Railways could transport armies, factories could produce weapons, steamships could move supplies, telegraph lines could transform information faster than any horse could ride. By the early 1850s, Europe stood at the edge of a transformation. The old methods of warfare still dominated military thinking, but the new technologies were quietly undermining century-old assumptions. Few leaders fully understood how profound the coming changes would be. When the Crimean War erupted in 1853, it became the first major test of this emerging industrial age. The conflict would reveal both the possibilities and the dangers of a modern technology. It would demonstrate that the future belonged not only to brave soldiers and talented generals, but also to engineers, industrialists, journalists, logisticians, and communication networks. The world that entered the Crimean War still resembled the age of Napoleon. The world that emerged from it was moving unmistakably towards the age of industry, mass media, and modern warfare. The transition had begun, and there would be no turning back. The Telegraph. Segment 3. The Telegraph changes warfare. For thousands of years, the speed of communication had remained largely unchanged. Messages traveled only as fast as human beings, a horse, or a ship could move. Empires rose and fell under this limitation. Kings governed vast territories, knowing that important information might take weeks or months to arrive. Generals fought battles without knowing what was happening beyond the horizon. Delays, uncertainty, and isolation were accepted as unavoidable realities of political and military life. Then humanity achieved something extraordinary. The invention of the electric telegraph allowed information to travel faster than any messenger in history. Instead of carrying words physically from one location to another, telegraph systems transmitted electrical lines through wires. Messages that once required days could now arrive within hours. Distance that had separated governments from armies for centuries suddenly seemed much smaller. The Crimean War became the first major conflict in which this revolutionary technology played a significant role. Before the war, military commanders often enjoyed immense freedom because communications with political leaders were slow and unreliable. A general operating hundreds of miles from the capital could make critical decisions without immediate oversight. Governments had little choice but to trust commanders, wait for reports to arrive. The telegraph began changing that relationship. For the first time, political leaders could receive updates from distant military theaters with unprecedented speed. Information about troop movements, supply shortages, victories and defeats, as well as battlefield conditions, could move across vast distances in a fraction of a time previously required. This development fundamentally altered the balance between governments and military commanders. Suddenly, politicians were no longer completely dependent on delayed reports. They could monitor campaigns more closely. They could ask questions, issue instructions, and react to events while operations were still unfolding. This battlefield and the government capital became connected in ways. The battlefield and the government capital became connected in ways that would have seemed almost magical only a few decades earlier. The implications were enormous. Wars had always involved uncertainty, but the telegraph reduced some form of ignorance. Governments gained a clearer picture of the ongoing military operations. Strategic decisions could be made using fresher information. Diplomats could react more quickly to changing conditions. Alliances could coordinate their activities more effectively. For Britain, this was especially important. The Crimean Peninsula was located far from London. In previous centuries, communications between the British government and a distant war zone would have been painfully slow. During the Crimean War, telegraph networks dramatically shortened this gap. Although this system was not yet perfect and still relied on multiple communication methods, the speed of information increased enough to change expectations permanently. Political leaders quickly became accustomed to receiving news more rapidly. Once this expectation developed, it became impossible to return to the old system. Governments increasingly demanded current information rather than waiting for weeks. However, the telegraph created new problems alongside its advantages. Faster communication encouraged greater political involvement in military affairs. Politicians who previously lacked the ability to intervene directly on operations now possessed a tool that allowed them to influence events from afar. Some military commanders welcomed this connection. Others viewed it as an intrusion. The conflict between political control and military interdependence would become one of the defining challenges of modern warfare. Generals often argued that battlefield decisions required flexibility and local knowledge. Politicians argued that wars served political objectives and therefore required political oversight. The telegraph intensified this debate by making interventions easier than before. Another consequence emerged from the growing speed of information. Failures became harder to hide. In earlier wars, a disastrous decision might remain unknown for weeks. By the time news reached the public, governments often had opportunities to reshape the narrative. The telegraph reduced this advantage. Information moved more quickly through official channels, but it also reached journalists and newspapers at unprecedented speed. As a result, military mistakes could become political crises much faster than before. Public expectations changed as well. Citizens increasingly wanted timely information about wars being fought in their name. They no longer accepted long periods of silence as normal. The demand for news grew alongside the technology capable of delivering it. This shift marked the beginning of something that now seems completely familiar: real-time public engagement with military conflicts. Today, governments, journalists, and citizens expect immediate information. Modern wars are followed through television broadcasts, satellite imagery, social media posts, and live reporting. The roots of this expectation can be traced back to developments that first appeared during conflicts like the Crimean War. The telegraph also influenced military planning itself. Commanders gradually recognized that communication networks could become strategic assets. Telegraph lines enabled coordination across larger distances. Information could move between different parts of an army more efficiently. Governments began investing more heavily in communication infrastructure because they understood that information itself was becoming a weapon. Future wars would expand this trend dramatically. The American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, and the First World War all demonstrated the growing importance of communications technology. Armies that managed information effectively gained significant advantage over those that did not. The Crimean War revealed an important truth that remains relevant even today. The speed of information can be as important as speed of movement. An army that knows what is happening can make better decisions than one operating in ignorance. A government that receives timely reports can respond more effectively and efficiently than one waiting for outdated information. Knowledge becomes increasingly valuable, and technology became the means through which knowledge flowed. By the end of this conflict, the telegraph had proven that warfare was entering a new era. The battlefield was no longer isolated from political center. Governments, commanders, journalists, and citizens were becoming connected through networks of information that stretched across continents. The age of delayed communication was ending. The age of information warfare had begun. The telegraph was only the first step, but it marked the moment when the flow of information became a decisive factor in the conduct of war. Segment 4. Railways bring industrial logistics to war. If the telegraph transformed communication, the railways transformed movement. For centuries, armies had been limited by the speed of men, horses, and wagons. No matter how brilliant a commander might be, no matter how courageous his soldiers are, every military campaign eventually confronted the same problem: how to move thousands of men and tons of supplies across great distances. Throughout history, logistics often determined victory more reliably than battlefield tactics. Armies that could feed themselves, equip themselves, or reinforce themselves eventually collapsed. Before the age of railways, the process was painfully slow. A large army required enormous quantities of food, ammunition, uniforms, medical supplies, tents, tools, and replacement equipment. Everything had to be transported using methods that had changed little since ancient times. Horse-driven wagons rolled across rough roads, ships carried supplies along rivers and coastlines. Human labor filled the gap between transportation systems. The larger an army became, the more difficult his challenges grew. A force of 50,000 soldiers consumed staggering amounts of resources every day. Horses required food and water. Soldiers needed bread, meat, and equipment. Weapons demanded ammunition. Sick and wounded men required medical care. Every mile further from home increased the burden on supply systems. Industrial Revolution offered a solution. Railways represented one of the most revolutionary technologies of the 19th century. Steam-powered locomotives could pull enormous loads over long distances at speeds unimaginable in previous generations. Goods that once required weeks of transportation could now arrive in days. Entire armies could be moved more rapidly than any military planner of the Napoleonic era would have believed possible. Crimean War became one of the first major conflicts to demonstrate the military potential of rail transportation. The most famous example emerged during the siege of Sevastopol, the military campaign of the war, the central campaign of the war. British and French forces faced immense logistical challenges while maintaining operations around the city. The movement of supplies from the coastal port to the frontline positions proved extremely difficult. Roads became muddy and clearly impassable. particularly during bad weather. Animals died from exhaustion and disease. Critical resources often failed to reach soldiers who desperately needed them. The situation became so severe that British authorities supported the construction of a military railway, known as the Grand Crimean Central Railway. The line connected supply depots near the coast to positions closer to the front. Built under wartime conditions, the railway dramatically improved the movement of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and other necessities. The results were immediate and significant. Supplies that previously required long and difficult journeys could now reach the front far more efficiently. The railway reduced dependence on exhausted animals and deteriorating roads. It demonstrated that industrial transportation could directly influence military effectiveness. Although modest by military standards, the achievement carried enormous symbolic importance. For the first time, a major war clearly showed that railways were not merely commercial tools. They were strategic assets capable of sustaining armies in combat. Military planners across Europe paid close attention to this lesson. The implication extended far beyond Crimea. If soldiers could supply armies, they could also mobilize them. Governments soon realized that railway networks could rapidly transport soldiers from one part of the country to another. Reinforcements could arrive faster, mobilization could occur on a larger scale, strategic flexibility increased dramatically. In previous centuries, assembling a large army often required months of preparations and movement. Railway compressed those timelines. Entire corps could travel distances that would have exhausted marching soldiers. Equipment could accompany them. Supplies could follow behind. The relationship between geography and military power began to change. Countries with extensive railway networks gained significant advantages. Industrial infrastructure became part of national defense. Governments increasingly viewed rail construction not merely as an economic project but as a strategic necessity. The connection between industry and military power became impossible to ignore. A nation's strength could no longer be measured solely by the bravery of its soldier or the skill of its general. Factories, railways, mines, steel production, and transportation networks all became components of military capability. Economic development and military effectiveness were becoming intertwined. The Crimean War exposed this reality in dramatic fashion. Armies that depended heavily on traditional transportation methods often struggled to sustain operations. Weather, terrain, and distance remained formidable obstacles. Yet railways offered a glimpse of a future in which industrial technology could overcome some of these challenges. Future conflicts would expand this strength enormously. During the American Civil War, railways became an essential instrument of strategy, allowing both sides to move troops and supplies at an unprecedented scale. The Franco-Prussian War demonstrated even more dramatically how efficient railway mobilization could determine the outcome of a conflict. By the time of the First World War, the entire war plan depended on complex railway timetables that coordinated the movement of millions of soldiers. The foundation of this transformation were visible in Crimea. Military leaders began recognizing that logistics were no longer a secondary concern. It was becoming one of the central determinants of success. The ability to transport sources efficiently could decide campaigns before battles even occurred. This represented a profound shift in military thinking. For centuries, military glory had focused on commanders, cavalry charges, and battlefield heroics. Railway highlighted something less dramatic but equally important: organization. Victory increasingly depended on engineers, planners, workers, and transportation networks operating far beyond the front lines. The age of purely battlefield-centered warfare was beginning to fade. In its place emerged a new reality where industrial systems supported military power on an unprecedented scale. The tracks laid across Crimea carried more than supplies. They carried a vision of the future. They demonstrated that wars would increasingly be won not only by soldiers at the front, but by the industrial machinery that sustained them from behind. The railway had become a weapon, and modern warfare would never be the same ever again. Segment 5. The birth of the war correspondent. Before the Crimean War, most civilians experienced war as a distant and mysterious event. Battles occurred far away from cities and towns. Information traveled slowly. Governments controlled much of the news that reached the public. Newspapers often relied on official reports, rumors, or delayed accounts from military officers. Ordinary citizens rarely knew exactly what was happening on the battlefield while the war was still being fought. For rulers and governments, these systems offered significant advantages. Military defeats could be concealed or minimalized. Failures could be expanded away. Political leaders could shape public understanding of events before alternative accounts emerged. The battlefield remained largely hidden from the eyes of the population. The Crimean War began changing that reality. For the first time in history, newspaper correspondents played a major role in reporting directly from a major conflict. Journalists traveled closer to fighting than ever before. They observed military operations, interviewed participants, and sent reports back to readers who were eager for information. A new relationship was forming between war and the public. The most famous of these correspondents was William Howard Russell of the Times. Russell accompanied British forces during the campaign and reported on conditions with remarkable honesty. Unlike many official reports, his articles described not only acts of courage but also incompetence, suffering, and administrative failures. His dispatches shocked readers. Many Britons expected stories of glorious victory and heroic military leadership. Instead, they encountered vivid descriptions of logistical chaos, inadequate medical care, supply shortages, and hardships endured by ordinary soldiers. For perhaps the first time on such a scale, civilians gained a relative unfiltered view of war. The reports revealed realities that governments preferred not to discuss. Soldiers lacked proper clothing during harsh winters, food distribution often failed, medical supplies were overwhelmed, bureaucratic inefficiency cost lives, disease spread through camps and devastating consequences. The public reaction was immediate. Newspapers became powerful political actors. Readers followed events in Crimea with an intensity rarely seen in previous conflicts. Politicians could no longer assume that military operations would remain hidden behind official statements. Journalists were creating an independent channel of information between the battlefield and the society. This development transformed accountability. In early wars, failures often remained buried within military archives or government correspondence. During the Crimean War, mistakes could become front-page news. Public outrage could pressure government into action. Political leaders increasingly found themselves answering not only to military realities, but also to public opinions. The power of information was becoming visible. A newspaper article could now influence national debates. Reports from the front could affect people's political careers. Military leaders discovered that battlefield success alone was no longer sufficient. Public perception mattered as well. This represented a revolutionary change in the nature of warfare. For centuries, war had largely been contests between states and armies. Now they were becoming a public event followed by millions of citizens. Governments had to consider how military actions would be viewed by voters, taxpayers, and readers. The Crimean War therefore marked the beginning of what modern observers would recognize as media warfare. Today, conflicts are covered by journalists, television crews, satellite networks, websites, and social media platforms. Governments carefully manage public messaging. Military operations are often evaluated not only for strategic effectiveness but also for the impact on public opinion. The origins of this phenomenon can be tracked to Crimea. The war correspondent became a new figure in international affairs. He was neither a soldier nor a politician, yet his influence could be enormous. By informing the public, he could shape political decisions, expose failures, and alter the course of national debates. Military leaders often viewed this development with suspicion. Many officers believed journalists interfered with operations or undermined morale. They worried that negative reporting could damage public support for the war effort. Some felt that civilians lacked the expertise necessary to understand military decisions. These tensions have never disappeared. Modern governments continue to struggle with questions about media access, wartime censorship, and the balance between operational security and public transparency. The same debate that began during the Crimean War continues in different forms even today. Yet, despite these controversies, the significance of the war correspondence cannot be overstated. Journalists helped transform war from distant affairs into public spectacle. They reduced the ability of government to monopolize information. They gave ordinary citizens a direct connection to events occurring hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. In doing so, they altered the relationship between society and warfare forever. The Crimean War demonstrated that information itself could become a force on the battlefield. Newspapers could influence politics. Public opinion could influence strategy. Journalists could expose truths that governments wished to conceal. The age of secrets the age of secret war was beginning to fade. A new era was emerging, one in which battles would be fought not only with rifles and artillery, but with words, images, and informations. The modern war correspondent stood at the center of transformation, serving as a bridge between the battlefield and the war, watching from afar. Segment 6: The Power of Photography. For most of human history, people imagined war rather than saw it. When citizens wanted to understand a battle, they relied on paintings, written descriptions, official reports, or stories told by returning soldiers. Artists often created dramatic scenes filled with heroism, courage, and patriotic symbolism. Kings appeared noble, generals appeared fearless, soldiers appeared disciplined and victorious. Even when artists attempted to portray reality, their work was influenced by interpretation, imagination, and political expectation. War was filtered through human perception. The Crimean War introduced something fundamentally different. For the first time in a major conflict, photography began documenting the realities of war. The technology was still primitive compared to modern standards. Cameras were large, heavy, and difficult to transport. Exposure times were long. Photographs couldn't capture fast-moving combat. Actual battles remained beyond the capabilities of contemporary equipment. Yet, despite these limitations, photography changed history. The most famous photographer associated with the conflict was Roger Fenton. In 1855, he traveled to Crimea with the goal of documenting the war through photographs. His mission was unprecedented. Never before had a major military campaign been systematically recorded using this new technology. The images he produced were remarkable. They showed camps, artillery positions, officers, landscapes, supply routes, and soldiers living amid the harsh realities of military life. Viewers could see actual locations rather than artistic interpretations. They could examine faces, uniforms, equipment, and terrain with a level of realism that paintings could never fully achieve. For Victorian audiences, this was revolutionary. Many people had never seen photographs from an active war zone. The images created a sense of immediacy and authenticity, unlike anything previously available. The public was no longer dependent solely on written records. They could observe parts of the conflict with their own eyes. One photograph became particularly famous, known as the Valley of the Shadow of Death. It depicted a desolate landscape scattered with cannonballs. The image conveyed a sense of destruction and danger without showing a single dead body. It became known as one of the most iconic photographs of the 19th century and remains one of the earliest examples of battlefield photography. Although Fenton avoided photographing corpses and graphic scenes, his work still represented a major shift. Photography introduced an entirely new relationship between war and reality. Paintings could exaggerate written reports, omit details. Photographs appeared objective. They seemed to provide direct evidence of what existed in front of camera lenses. Whether completely accurate or not, photographs carried an authority that other forms of communications possessed. This authority transformed public perception. Citizens could now examine aspects of war independently. They didn't need to rely entirely on governments, generals, or artists to tell them what happened. Visual evidence began entering political and social discourses. The implications were enormous. Governments gradually realized that the future of war would not be observed rather than merely described. Public opinions could be influenced by images as well as words. Military leaders increasingly understood that visual representation might affect support for a conflict. Photography also changed historical memory. Previous generations remembered wars through paintings, monuments, and written records. The Crimean War left behind photographic records that allowed future generations to view actual scenes from the conflict. Historians gained access to a new type of evidence. The past became more tangible and more accessible, yet the limitations of early photography are equally important. Because cameras required long exposure time, photographers couldn't capture combat itself. Images often appeared calm and orderly compared to the chaos experienced by soldiers. The most violent aspect of war remained largely invisible. This meant that early war photography occupied an unusual position. It revealed more than any previous visual medium, yet it still concealed much of the conflict's brutality. Viewers saw camps, artillery, and landscape, but rarely witnessed the bloodshed occurring on the battlefield. Future technological advances would remove these limitations. By the time of the American Civil War, photographers were producing more direct images of war's human cost. During the First World War and the Second World War, photography became an essential component of journalism, propaganda, intelligence gathering, and historical documentation. Even moving pictures would join still photography. Film, television, satellite imagery, digital media would push this transformation even further. The root of all these developments can be found in Crimea. The Crimean War demonstrated that technology could bring distant conflicts into homes of ordinary people. It revealed that images possessed extraordinary power. A photograph could shape opinions, preserve memories, and influence political discussion in ways that previous generations had never experienced. The battlefield was becoming visible. The visibility altered warfare itself. Governments could no longer assume that the public would remain detached from military realities. Journalists could provide evidence rather than mere descriptions. Citizens could observe parts of a conflict directly, even from thousands of miles away. The camera didn't kill anyone in Crimea. It fired no bullets, commanded no armies. Yet its impact proved profound. The Crimean War marked the beginning of a new age in which wars would not only be fought and reported, they would also be seen. And once the world learned to see war, it could never entirely look away. Segment 7: Industrial Production and Modern Supply Chains. When people think about war, they usually imagine battles. They picture soldiers they picture soldiers charging across fields, artillery firing into distances, ships engaging in combat, and generals making life or death decisions. These dramatic moments dominate popular memory because they are visible, emotional, and easy to understand. Yet by the middle of the 19th century, another reality was becoming increasingly important. Wars were no longer won solely on battlefields. They were also won in factories, workshops, mines, rail yards, ports, warfares, and shipyards. The Crimean War revealed this transformation more clearly than any major conflict before it. It showed that industrial capacity and the ability to produce, transport, and sustain resources on a massive scale was becoming a decisive factor in military power. This represented a profound shift in human history. For centuries, armies that depended heavily on local resources and relatively simple supply systems, while logistics had always mattered, production capabilities were limited by the technologies of the time. Manufacturing occurred largely through manual labor. Transportation networks were slow. Economic output remained constrained by the physical limits of pre-industrial society. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Factories could now produce in quantities that earlier generations would have considered unimaginable. Steam-powered machinery increased productivity dramatically. Iron and coal industries expanded rapidly. New manufacturing techniques reduced cost and increased output. For governments, these developments carried obvious military implications. A nation capable of producing large quantities of weapons, ammunition, uniforms, tools, or equipments possessed a significant advantage over rivals with weaker industrial base. Military strength increasingly depended not only on the size of the army but also on the economic machinery supporting it. Crimean War proved a powerful demonstration of this reality. Britain entered the conflict as the world's leading industrial power. The country possessed extensive manufacturing capabilities, advanced shipbuilding industries, and vast commercial networks stretching across the globe. France also benefited from growing industrial development. Russia, despite its enormous size and population, faced greater challenges. The Russian Empire remained less industrialized than many of its Western rivals. Transportation networks were less developed. Manufacturing capacity lagged behind that of Britain. These structural weaknesses affected Russia's ability to sustain long-term military operations. The difference became increasingly apparent as the war continued. Maintaining a modern army required an enormous flow of resources. Soldiers needed rifles, ammunition, boots, food, medical supplies, tents, and replacement equipment. Horses needed fodder, artillery required shells, ships required fuel and maintenance. Every day consumed vast quantities of material. This side, capable of producing and delivering these resources more efficiently, enjoyed a growing advantage. This was not a glamorous aspect of warfare. Factory warfare rarely appeared in heroic paintings. Warehouse managers didn't receive medals for bravery. Engineers responsible for transportation network remained largely invisible to the public. Yet their contributions became increasingly indispensable. A rifle manufactured in a distant factory could influence the outcome of a battle hundreds of miles away. A coal mine in one region could power steamships operating in another. Industrial workers became participants in warfare, even though they never entered combat. The distinction between a civilian economies and military operations begins to blur. This was one of the most significant developments of the modern age. In earlier periods, war were often fought primarily by professional armies, while much of the society continued functioning separately. Industrial warfare created deeper connections between military operations and national economies. Entire populations became linked to the war effort through production, transportation, and resource management. Crimean War provided an early glimpse of this phenomena. Governments discovered that victory suspended on more than tactical skill. Industrial organization mattered, economic strength mattered, supply chains mattered. The battlefield increasingly reflected the capability of the society behind it. Steamships further accelerated this transformation. Unlike traditional sailing vessels, steam-powered ships often offered greater reliability and predictability. They reduced dependency on wind conditions and improved the movement of supplies across long distances. Industrial technology was reshaping not only production but also transportation. The cumulative effect was revolutionary. Military power was becoming a function of industrial power. A nation with superior factories, transport networks, resource extraction industries, and logistical systems could sustain larger and more effective military operations. Economic development became directly linked to a strategic capability. Future conflicts would confirm this lesson repeatedly. During the American Civil War, the industrial superiority of the Union became one of the greatest advantages. During the First World War, entire economies were mobilized for military production. During the Second World War, factories became strategically important as armies themselves. The famous phrase total war would eventually emerge to describe conflicts in which entire societies participated in the struggle. The origins of that concept can be traced back to developments already visible during the Crimean War. The conflict demonstrated that industrial systems were becoming weapons in their own right. A railway could be as valuable as a regiment. A factory could be as important as a fortress. A supply depot could be as influential as a battlefield commander. This realization permanently changed military planning. Governments began investing more heavily in infrastructure, manufacturing, transportation, and economic development. Industrial capacity became an essential component of national security. Military leaders increasingly viewed logistics and production as strategic priorities rather than secondary concerns. The Crimean War therefore marked more than military transitions. It marked the emergence of a new relationship between war and society. Victory was no longer determined solely by men who fought at the war. It was increasingly determined by the workers who produced weapons, engineers who built railways, and the sailors who transported supplies, the miners who extracted resources, and the industrial system that connected them all. The modern battlefield was expanding. It now stretched far beyond the front lines, reaching into factories, ports, railroads, and economic networks, often across entire nations. The age of industrial warfare had begun, and the road would never return to simpler conflicts of the past. Segment 8. The Medical Revolution. One of the most shocking realities of the Crimean War was the greatest threat to soldiers often didn't come from enemy bullets, it came from diseases. While most people imagine warfare, they assume that casualties result primarily from combat. They picture gunfire, artillery bombardments, cavalry charges, and fierce battlefield engagements. Yet, throughout much of history, diseases consistently kill soldiers more than weapons ever did. The Crimean War was no exception. In fact, the conflict exposed medical failures on such a scale that it forced governments, military leaders, and the public to rethink how armies cared for their soldiers. Out of this disaster emerged reforms that helped create the foundation of modern military medicine. The conditions facing many soldiers were horrific. Military camps often suffered from poor sanitation. Waste disposal was inadequate. Water supply became contaminated. Food shortages were unreliable. Food storage was unreliable. Overcrowding increased the spread of infectious diseases. Hospitals lacked proper organization, supplies, and hygiene standards. The result was predictable and devastating. Diseases such as cholera, typhus, dysentery, and various infections spread rapidly through military camps and hospitals. Thousands of soldiers who survived battle later died from illness that modern medicine could prevent or treat. The tragedy became particularly visible within British forces. Reports from Crimea revealed that wounded soldiers frequently endured appalling conditions after reaching medical facilities. Hospitals were overcrowded, supplies were insufficient, basic cleanliness was often neglected. Administrative inefficiency compounded every problem. The public was stunned. Many citizens had assumed that the government possessed the ability to care for soldiers serving abroad. Instead, newspaper reports described suffering on a scale that seemed almost unbelievable. The gap between military bravery and medical competence became painfully clear. Into this crisis stepped one of the most influential figures in military history. Florence Nightingale arrived in Crimea in 1854 with a team of nurses. Although she would later become known as the Lady with the Lamp, her true significance extended far beyond symbolism. Nightingale approached medical care with a level of organization and analytical thinking that was unusual for her time. She observed hospitals conditions directly. She documented problems systematically. She identified sanitation failures, supply shortages, administrative weakness. Rather than accepting suffering as inevitable, she searched for practical solutions. Her findings were alarming. Many deaths were not caused by battle wounds at all. They resulted from preventable diseases spread through unsanitary conditions. Soldiers who might have recovered from injuries instead succumbed to infections and illnesses acquired after entering hospitals. This realization transformed the conversation about military medicine. For centuries, diseases had often been viewed as an unavoidable consequence of war. Nightingale and her colleagues demonstrated that many causes of illness had been reduced through better management, sanitation, ventilation, nutrition, and hygiene. Cleanliness became a weapon against death. Improved sanitation reduced infection rates. Better hospitals organization increased efficiency. Attention to nutrition strengthened recovery. These measures appear obvious today, but during the Crimean War, they represented major advances. Nightingale's work was also revolutionary because of her use of statistics. She collected data on mortality rates and hospital outcomes. She analyzed patterns of illness and death. She used evidence rather than assumptions to argue for reform. In doing so, she helped pioneer a more scientific approach to healthcare. Medical decisions increasingly became linked to measurable results. Statistics proved powerful tools for identifying problems and evaluating solutions. The modern concept of evidence-based healthcare owes much to developments that emerged during and after the Crimean War. The effects often extended beyond Britain. Military observers throughout Europe studied the lessons of the conflict. Governments recognized that maintaining healthy armies required far more than weapons and training. Medical infrastructure became an essential component of military effectiveness. This was an important strategic realization. Every soldier lost to diseases represented a reduction in combat capability. Every preventable death weakened an army. Medical care was not merely a humanitarian concern, it was a military necessity. The Crimean War therefore expanded the definition of military power. A strong army needed competent doctors, organized hospitals, sanitation systems, supply networks, and effective administration. Success depended not only on battlefield performance but also on the ability to preserve the health of soldiers. Future war would also depend upon these lessons. During the American Civil War, medical services became more organized and professional. By the time the First World War came in, advances in surgery, sanitation, and military logistics saved countless lives. The 20th century would witness extraordinary developments in military medicine, from blood transfusion to antibiotics and beyond. Many of such achievements can trace part of their lineage back to Crimea. The war exposed the deadly consequence of neglecting healthcare. It demonstrated that disease could be as dangerous as enemy armies. It proved that organization, science, and sanitation could dramatically improve survival rates. More importantly, it changed public expectations. Citizens increasingly demanded that governments care for soldiers properly. Medical failures became as matters of political concern. Healthcare emerged as an area where competence could no longer be taken for granted. The Crimean War began as a conflict between empires. It became something more. It became a lesson in which value of human life and the importance of scientific medicine. Amid the mud disease and the suffering of Crimea, a medical revolution was quietly taking shape. Its effects would extend far beyond the battlefield, influencing healthcare systems, nursing practices, and public health policies around the world for generations to come. Segment 9. The Charge of the Light Brigade. The old warfare meets new realities. Few moments from the Crimean War were as famous as the Charge of the Light Brigade. For more than a century and a half after the battle, the event remains one of the most recognizable military disasters in history. It has inspired poems, books, paintings, films, and endless debates. To many people, it represents extraordinary courage. To others, it symbolizes catastrophic incompetence. In reality, it was both. More importantly, it perfectly illustrates why the Crimean War stood between two different eras of warfare. The event occurred on October 25th, 1854, during the Battle of Balaclava. British forces were attempting to defend key positions against Russian attacks. The battlefield was chaotic. Orders moved through multiple commanders. Information was incomplete. Confusion spread rapidly. At the center of the crisis stood the British Light Brigade. The unit consisted of approximately 670 cavalrymen. These soldiers were trained for speed, reconnaissance, pursuit, and rapid attacks against vulnerable targets. They were not designed to conduct frontal assaults against heavily defended artillery positions. Yet that is precisely what happened. A series of misunderstandings, vague orders, and communication failures produced one of the most infamous military blunders ever recorded. British commanders intended to prevent Russian forces from removing captured guns from the battlefield. Somewhere between the issuing of orders and their execution, critical details became lost or misunderstood. The result was a disaster. The Light Brigade received instructions that led them directly into a valley surrounded by Russian artillery positions. Cannons stood not only at the end of the valley but also on elevated ground along both sides. Any force advancing through this area would be exposed to devastating fire from multiple directions. The cavalrymen understood this danger. Many recognized that the attack made little tactical sense. Yet military discipline demanded obedience. Orders had been given. The brigade advanced. What followed became legendary. Hundreds of horsemen charged forward under relentless artillery fire. Cannonballs tore through formations. Horses collapsed. Riders were thrown from saddles. Explosions erupted around them. The brigade continued advancing despite mounting casualties. This spectacle stunned observers. Against overwhelming odds, the artillery reached their Russian gun positions. Close combat followed. Some artillery crews were attacked successfully, yet the achievement couldn't change the fundamental reality of the situation. The brigade had charged into a position it could not realistically hold. After reaching the enemy line, survivors were forced to withdraw through the same deadly corridor. More artillery fire followed. Casualties increased further. By the end of the engagement, the brigade had suffered devastating losses. Of the roughly 670 men who began the charge, many were killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of horses were lost. The military value of the attack remained highly questionable, yet the courage displayed by the soldiers was undeniable. Observers recognized the extraordinary bravery required to advance in such conditions. The charge became immortalized through the famous poem The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson, which celebrated the sacrifice and the obedience of the men involved. The poem helped transform the event into a symbol of heroism. However, historians increasingly viewed the charge through a different lens. The disaster revealed the growing mismatch between traditional military thinking and modern military battlefield realities. For centuries, cavalry had been one of the most powerful forces in warfare. Mounted warriors often dominated battlefields. Speed, mobility, and shock action could break enemy formations and determine outcomes. Military cultures across Europe revered cavalry traditions. The problem was that technology was changing. Artillery was becoming more effective. Firearms were becoming more accurate. Defensive firepower was increasing. Industrial age weapons were making traditional cavalry assaults increasingly dangerous. The charge of the Light Brigade exposed this transformation dramatically. The cavalrymen displayed immense courage, but conditions alone couldn't overcome concentrated modern firepower. The attack highlighted a lesson that would become more clearer in later wars. Bravery cannot compensate indefinitely for flawed tactics and outdated assumptions. This lesson would repeat itself throughout the second half of the 19th century. The American Civil War demonstrated the growing power of rifles and artillery. The Franco-Prussian War reinforced the importance of weapons modernization and organization. By the time the First World War, machine guns and artillery made many traditional offensive tactics catastrophically costly. The Light Brigade therefore occupies a unique place in military history. It was not simply a tactical cavalry charge failure. It was a symbol of an age struggling to adapt. The citizens who planned and directed military operations often belonged to traditions shaped by earlier wars. Their assumptions reflected a war where personal bravery, aggressive action, cavalry maneuver could achieve decisive results. Yet the technologies emerging during the 19th century were altering the rules of warfare. The battlefield was becoming more lethal. Communication systems were changing. Industrial production was transforming logistics. Railways were reshaping movement. Telegraphs were accelerating decision-making. Firepower was steadily increasing. Old doctrines could no longer be accepted without question. The tragedy of the Light Brigade demonstrated the consequence of failing to recognize this reality. Today, military historians frequently cite the change as an example of the dangers of institutional inertia. The tendency of organization to cling to outdated ideas even as circumstances change. The soldiers paid the price for failures that originated far above their heads. Yet the story endures because it contains both tragedy and admiration. The charge revealed the limits of courage in industrial age. It exposed the flaws of outdated military thinking. It highlighted the growing power of modern technology. At the same time, it showcases the extraordinary determination of ordinary soldiers placed in impossible circumstances. In many ways, the charge of the Light Brigade captured the essence of the Crimean War itself, a conflict suspended between two worlds. A foot remained planted in the age of horsemen, aristocratic officers, and Napoleon traditions. The other stepped towards the age of industry, technology, and modern warfare. The men who rode into the valley of death didn't know they were participating in more than a battle. They were witnessing the end of one military era and the uncertain beginning of another. Chapter 10. Strategic Lessons by Future Generations. Strategic Lessons Learned by Future Generations. When Crimean War ended in 1856, the fighting stopped, but the analysis had only begun. Across Europe and beyond, military officers, politicians, engineers, journalists, and scholars studied the conflict in extraordinary detail. Reports were written, committees were established, military academics examined campaigns and battles. Governments investigated failures and successes. Everyone wanted to understand what the war had achieved about the future. The answer would shape warfare for generations. The Crimean War was not the largest conflict of the 19th century, it was the deadliest. It was not even the most technologically advanced by modern standards, yet it occupied a unique position in history because it served as a bridge between two eras. Observers recognized that something fundamental had changed. The war demonstrated that industrial technology was becoming separable from military power. Railways, telegraphs, steamships, mass production, journalism, photography, and modern logistics had all influenced the outcome of the conflict. Future military planners could no longer focus solely on tactics and battlefield leadership. They had to think about systems. This represented a revolutionary shift in military thinking. For centuries, military education had emphasized commanders, battles, and maneuver. Great leaders such as Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon Bonaparte were studied primarily for their battlefield achievement. The Crimean War suggested that future victories might depend just as much as logistics, communications, transportations, and industrial organization. The implications were enormous. Military academics across Europe began paying greater attention to infrastructure, administration, and technology. Engineers gained increasing importance within armed forces. Governments invested more heavily in railways, communication networks, and national power were becoming broader and more complex than traditional military strength alone. Perhaps nowhere were the lessons more visible than in the United States. Just a few years after the Crimean War ended, the American Civil War erupted. Both the Union and the Confederacy carefully studied European military developments, including those observed in Crimea. Many lessons reappeared on American battlefields. Railways became critical strategic assets. Telegraph systems connected military commanders with political leaders. Industrial production played a decisive role. Logistics emerged as one of the most important factors determining military success. Newspaper reported extensively on military operations, shaping public opinion throughout the conflict. The Union's industrial superiority eventually became one of its greatest advantages. This echoed lessons already visible during the Crimean War. Europe learned even more dramatic lessons during the following decades. The rise of Otto von Bismarck and the military reforms of Helmut von Moltke the Elder transformed Prussia into one of the most formidable military powers in Europe. Moltke paid particular interest to railways and communications. He understood that the transportation networks could determine the speed and effectiveness of military mobilization. During the Franco-Prussian War, Prussia demonstrated the extraordinary potential of railway-based military planning. Troops moved with unprecedented efficiency. Mobilization occurred rapidly. Strategic coordination reached levels impossible in previous generations. Many of these ideas had roots in observations made during or after Crimea. The importance of communications also became increasingly clear. The telegraph had shown that information could travel faster than armies themselves. Governments and commanders who controlled information possessed significant advantages. Future military organizations invested heavily in communication systems and because they understood that knowledge could influence the outcome of campaigns. At the same time, the Crimean War revealed the dangers of bureaucratic incompetence. Poor logistics, administrative confusion, and the ineffective coordination had contributed to unnecessary suffering throughout the conflict. Future military reforms often focused on improving organization rather than merely increasing firepower. This was another important lesson. Modern warfare required professional institutions. Heroic individuals remained important. But large-scale conflicts increasingly depended on efficient systems. Staff officers, logisticians, engineers, medical personnel, and administrators became essential components of military success. The medical lessons proved equally influential. The work of Florence Nightingale inspired reforms in healthcare, nursing, sanitation, and military medicine. Governments recognized that preserving soldiers' health was a strategic necessity rather than an optional concern. Future armies invested more heavily in medical-based services because the Crimean experience demonstrated the devastating consequences of neglect. The information of journalism and photography continued growing as well. Governments understood that public opinion could affect wartime decisions. Journalists became increasingly permanent features of military conflicts. The relationship between media and warfare became more complex with each passing decade. The battlefield was no longer isolated from society. This lesson would become increasingly important in the 20th century. By the time Europe entered the First World War, many of the trends first visible in Crimea had matured dramatically. Industrial production sustained enormous armies. Railways moved millions of soldiers. Communication networks coordinated operations across vast fronts. Medical systems treated casualties on an unprecedented scale. Governments mobilized entire societies for war. The war of 1814 was vastly different from the world of 1853. Yet the path connected those two eras passed directly through Crimea. Military historians often describe Crimean War as a laboratory of modern warfare, not because every modern innovation appeared there, but because the conflict revealed the direction in which warfare was evolving. The future was becoming visible. Technology would matter more, industry would matter more, logistics would matter more. Information would matter more, organization would matter more. These lessons influenced military planning long after the guns of Crimea fell silent. The soldiers who fought on the peninsula could not have known that the future generations would study their experiences so closely, yet their war became a classroom for the modern world. The battlefields of Crimea taught nations that warfare was changing. Those who understood the lessons gained advantages. Those who ignored them risked being left behind. In this sense, the Crimean War was not merely a conflict of the 19th century. It was a preview of the 20th. Segment 11. Why historians still debate the label. Today, the Crimean War is often described as the first modern war. The phrase appeared in books, documentaries, university lectures, and military history. It is a compelling label because it captures the sense that something important changed during this conflict. Railways appeared on the battlefield. Telegraphs accelerated communications. Journalists reported directly from the front. Photographs documented military life. Industrial logistics became increasingly important. Modern medicine became emerging from the horrors of wartime diseases. Yet, not every historian agrees with that level. The debate continues because the first modern war is far more complicated than it initially appears. The central question is simple: what exactly makes a war modern? Different historians answer this question in different ways. Some focus on technology, others focus on industrial production, some focus on communication systems, others highlight mass mobilization, nationalism, or the relationship between government and society, depending on which factors are considered most important. Different conflicts can claim this title. Those who support the Crimean War's claim point to the remarkable combination of innovations visible during this conflict. No previous major war had integrated so many emerging technologies at once. Telegraph networks connected governments to military operations, railways contributed to logistics, steamships supported transportations, newspaper brought battlefield reports directly to the public. The photography created visual record of military life. Military reforms emerged in response to unprecedented scrutiny. From this perspective, the Crimean War represented the first clear glimpse of the modern military world. It was not any single technology. It was not that any single technology was entirely new. Telegraphs existed before Crimea. Railways existed before Crimea. Photography existed before Crimea. What made the conflict significant was that these innovations began interacting within a major international war. The combination mattered more than any individual intervention. Supporters of this interpretation argue that the Crimean War revealed how industrial age technologies would reshape military affairs. The conflict served as a transition point between traditional warfare and industrialized conflicts that would dominate the next century. However, critics raise important objections. Some historians argue that the Crimean War remained fundamentally tied to older military traditions. Cavalry continued playing a major role. Muskets remained common weapons. Armies were relatively small compared to those of later conflicts. Industrial production influenced operations, but not on the massive scale seen during later wars. From this perspective, Crimea was only partially modern. It contained elements of the future while remaining deeply rooted in the past. Other historians point to the American Civil War, a stronger candidate for this title. The American conflict featured extensive railway operations, telegraph communications, industrial production, large-scale mobilization, trench systems, ironclad warships, casualty levels that foreshadows 20th century warfare. Some scholars argue that these characteristics make it a more convincing example of a truly modern war. The scale alone was extraordinary. The American Civil War involved millions of participants and demonstrated industrial warfare more comprehensively than Crimea. It revealed how modern technology could combine with mass armies to produce unprecedented destruction. Others look even farther ahead. Some historians argue that the first true modern war was the Franco-Prussian War. This conflict showcased highly organized rail mobilization, modern staff planning, industrial production, and increasingly advanced weaponry. It also highlighted the growing importance of national power and bureaucratic efficiency. Still, others reserve the title for the First World War itself. The argument is that genuinely modern warfare requires machine guns, large-scale artillery, aircraft tanks, mass conscription, and total economic mobilization. Industrial destruction on unprecedented scale. According to this view, earlier conflicts merely anticipated modern warfare without fully embodying it. The disagreement ultimately reflects a deeper challenge. History rarely changes overnight. There is a seldom single movement that one era ends and another begins. Instead, transformation usually occurs gradually. Old ideas persist while new ideas emerge. Different generations overlap. Elements of the future coexist with remnants of the past. The Crimean War fits this pattern perfectly. On one side stood traditional military culture. Aristocratic officers commanded cavalry units. Tactical thinking remained heavily influenced by the Napoleonic era. Battlefield leadership still emphasized concepts developed during earlier centuries. On the other side stood the emerging forces of industrial modernity. Railways, telegraphs, photography, journalism, modern medicine, and industrial logistics were beginning to transform warfare in ways that would become increasingly apparent during later conflicts. The war belonged to both worlds simultaneously. This dual nature may continue to strengthen the argument for its historical significance. Rather than being fully modern, the Crimean War revealed the process through which modern warfare became modern. It exposed the tensions between old assumptions and new realities. It showed military institutions struggling to adapt to technology and social changes. In many ways, that struggle remains familiar even today. Modern militaries continue confronting new technologies that challenge established doctrines. Cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, drones, satellite systems, and digital communications are creating transformations comparable to those produced by railways and telegraphs in the 19th century. The same question still persists: how quickly should institutions adopt? Which innovations will prove decisive? Which traditions remain useful? Which assumptions have become obsolete? The Crimean War often provides valuable insight because it captures a moment when such questions first emerged at a larger scale. Whether it deserves the title of the first modern war may never be settled completely, but perhaps that it is not the most important issue. What matters is that the conflict marked a turning point. It revealed the arrival of forces that would reshape warfare forever. It demonstrated that technology, industry, information, and organization were becoming increasingly central to military power. The debate itself reflects the war's significance. Historians continue arguing about Crimea because the conflict sits at the crossroad of military history. It was not entirely old, it was not entirely new. It was the moment when the modern war began to appear on the battlefield. Segment 12. Conclusion. The war that opened the modern age. When the Crimean War began in 1853, most Europeans believed they understood warfare. The great military model remained the age of Napoleon. Armies marched across continents, cavalry conducted reconnaissance and decisive attacks, generals sought battlefield victories that would break the enemy's will, governments directed wars from distant capitals while citizens waited weeks or months to learn about what had happened. By the time peace arrived in 1856, the war was beginning to disappear. That world was beginning to disappear. The Crimean War didn't invent modern warfare. It didn't introduce new technology that would later dominate battlefields. Machine guns, tanks, aircraft, submarines, radio communications, and countless other innovations still lay in the future. Yet the conflict revealed something even more important. It revealed the direction of history. For the first time, the essential building blocks of modern warfare appeared together with a major international conflict. The telegram connected governments to distant battlefields with unprecedented speed. Railways demonstrated the strategic importance of industrial transportation. Journalists transformed the relationship between public opinion and war. Photography allowed civilians to see military realities with their own eyes. Industrial production supplied armies on a scale that earlier generations could never have imagined. Medical reformers showed that organization and science could have saved lives previously lost due to diseases and neglect. Individually, each development was significant. Together, they represented a revolution. The battle was no longer an isolated space occupied only by soldiers and commanders. It became connected to factories, newspapers, telegraph offices, railway networks, hospitals, government ministries, and entire economies. War was expanding. Military power increasingly depended upon the strength of system rather than merely the bravery of individuals. Our nation's railway mattered. Its industrial capacity mattered. Its communication infrastructure mattered. Its infrastructure competence mattered. Its ability to mobilize resources mattered. These realities would define the next century of warfare. The lessons learned in Crimea echoed across future conflicts. The American Civil War demonstrated the growing power of industrial warfare. The Franco-Prussian War showcased the strategic value of rail modernization. The First World War transformed industrial conflict into global catastrophe involving entire societies. The Second World War pushed those trends even further, combining technology, production, logistics, and communications on an unprecedented scale. The road to these conflicts didn't begin in 1914, it began in Crimea. The war also revealed another truth, that what remains relevant today the war also revealed another truth that remains relevant even today. Technological progress doesn't eliminate human error. The Crimean War featured remarkable innovations, yet it is also marked by confusion, incompetence, bureaucratic failures, unnecessary suffering. The telegraph accelerated communication, but poor decisions still occurred. Railways improved logistics, yet supply failures persisted. Medical knowledge advanced, yet disease remained devastating. Technology changed warfare, but it didn't change human nature. This lesson would repeat throughout modern history. Every new innovation promised advantages, but every advantage created new challenges as well. Faster communications produced information overload. Industrial production increased both prosperity and destructive capability. Modern medicine saved lives, while modern weapons found new ways to take them. The Crimean War therefore occupies a unique place in history. It was a war of transition. The soldiers who fought often lived according to assumptions inherited from earlier centuries. Many officers still believed in doctrines shaped by Napoleonic era. Cavalry charges remained symbols of military glory. Aristocratic traditions continued influencing command structures. Yet, surrounding these familiar institutions was an emerging world powered by machines, information networks, industrial production, and scientific thinking. The future had arrived, even if many people had not yet recognized it. This is why historians continue to study the conflict more than 170 years later. The Crimean War was not merely a struggle between empires over territory and influence. It was a glimpse into the future of warfare and society itself. Modern governments, modern media, modern logistics, modern communications, and modern public opinions all appeared in recognizable forms during the conflict. The war acted as a minor reflecting the century that was about to come. When people today watch news about distant conflicts, they are witnessing a system whose origins can be traced back to Crimea. When military planners discuss logistics, communications, medical supports, infrastructure, industrial capacity, they are dealing with lessons first demonstrated on large scale during the war. When governments worry about public perception and media coverage, they are confronting realities that emerged during the 19th century. The world created by the Industrial Revolution met the world of warfare in Crimea. The encounter changed both forever. In the end, the Crimea War was more than a regional conflict. It was more than a diplomatic struggle between great powers. It was more than a military campaign fought on the shores of the Black Sea. It was the moment where war stepped into the modern age. It was the old war didn't vanish immediately. In the end, the Crimean War was more than a regional conflict. It was more than a diplomatic struggle between great powers. It was more than a military campaign fought on the shores of the Black Sea. It was the moment when war stepped into the modern age. The old war didn't vanish immediately. The new world didn't emerge fully formed. For a brief period, both existed together on the battlefield of Crimea. This is why the conflict remains so important. It was the war between two eras, and when it ended, the modern world had begun.